I think that people in their 40s, 50s, and older in this region have grown up convinced that infrastructure is the main prerogative of the state. It's kind of the natural monopoly. It's the state that has to provide these kinds of strategic infrastructure, strategic to life. And of course, it's unthinkable that the state would not provide infrastructure, and it's within its capacity. If a state does not have the traditional means to extend infrastructure and design them, then they will always have either to borrow or to do something about it. But in our brains or in our minds, the state provides the infrastructure. And this is where I want to start by unhinging this conviction. Infrastructures now are not provided by the state. In fact, the state's role, as I'm going to explain, has become the facilitator and also the entity that has to control the risks that investors might face when they put their monies into the infrastructure. And here, my fascination with infrastructure came actually from my work in India and Egypt, comparing the privatization of highways. Highways and transport infrastructure. And I think, as I mentioned in my abstract, I'm going to tackle the question of why is it that all of a sudden many countries in the global south, and particularly in the Middle East or the MENA region, are witnessing this huge resurgence of mega infrastructure projects that are primarily transport, whether we're talking about marine, like maritime transport, or even roadways, mega projects like in Cairo here, the monorail, and other. We have like 4,800 plus kilometers of new roadways and expanded existing roadways. So what is it that could explain, especially that if we look carefully at the budgets, the state budgets, whether we're talking about Cairo, Sudan, or elsewhere, they are not enough. There's no enough money. There's no enough money. So where is this whole thing coming from? And here I argue that in order for us to understand this resurgence, we need to look at two forces, global forces, that came to converge. The first one was, of course, the post-financial crisis situation, when Basel III agreement regulating international bank performances made it clear that the banks have to channel their liquidity in countries that are lower in the financial and monetary hierarchy. And that the best thing to do would to channel this in the form of financial instruments for infrastructure projects. And I will not go into the details of how this nexus between finance and infrastructure came to wed. But I will just mention that post-Basel III, we also have the G20 establishing the Global Financial Hub, the Global Infrastructure Hub, that started spreading the narrative of infrastructure gap. And this gap is actually, for the layman or the layperson, it's that you are a country with deficient infrastructure. But in reality, it's actually the gap between the liquidity in the global north and the imperative to circulate this kind of finance or money through finance, and a gap of the geographic spread of these kinds of financial investments. So that's one, and of course I can elaborate in the Q&A about this issue. The other force that came to converge with this one was, in fact, the changes in the architecture of multinational or multilateral development organizations. So if we look carefully at how the World Bank, for instance, or the African Development Bank, or the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, what happened to them in terms of their mandates, we will recognize that now these kinds of international organizations also have to get into the private financial markets. And both forces give credit to this unrelentless expanding narrative of infrastructure gap. And here I want to ask the question also, does these countries actually need these kinds of projects? Does these projects, or do these projects reflect a real demand on the ground? Not only considering that people might be interested in having these kinds of glamorous projects, but I mean in terms of the capacity of the households, the capacity of individuals to actually spend or even use these kinds of infrastructures, bearing in mind that if we look carefully at how the projects are financed and how who have the recourse, it's actually quite interesting that these projects, by virtue of their financial origin, they cannot lend themselves to public scrutiny or ifsah, disclosure. And not only that, but even the projects themselves, the state agencies that have initiated the financial instruments behind these projects are not entitled to disclose their books. And also they cannot be recourse. I mean, nobody can actually sue them or even ask them to disclose their financials. Because of the design of the project financing system of these projects. Well, what I want to say is that in order for when these two forces converged, it's quite interesting that the third force that came, I wouldn't say unexpected, but was unintended, is the fact that these two forces come very handy to the regimes of many of the MENA countries. Especially regimes that are deficient in legitimacy, or those like in Egypt, for instance, with the will to prove that we are capable of handling turbulent times. So these two forces give the regime the opportunity to build big and quick. So to prove, it's another way of saying, to prove to their constituencies, to their citizens, that we are strong, able to deliver these kinds of humongous infrastructure in short time. But what I want to say is that when this happens, we're actually falling into instability. It's not only instability of the regime, but it's instability in the financial component itself. Because of the nature of these kinds of financial instruments, they have lots of dissonances, different maturity periods, different risk parameters, different even interest risk or revenue risk or loss. And they have to be, okay, 1 minute, yes. And they also have to have tremendous portfolio, a portfolio that is diverse. So it's not only one project, but different projects that have to come under the same investment portfolio in order to allow the buyers, who are mostly institutional buyers like EBRD or Deutsche Bank, to invest. And the idea also is that it places, because of the nature of these financial instruments, governments have to pay the profit immediately. It's not a long-term investment or a long-term like in traditional banking systems. So what happens is that we find many regimes are doing the Ponzi scheme-like investment. So they would sell or issue certain types of financial instruments here, issue another there, try to pay the immediate profit across the two investors, and so on and so forth. But the one thing that also the governments or the regimes have to do is what happens internally. They have to also transform the agencies, the state agencies, the ones that used to be the natural monopoly over infrastructure. So we have institutions or agencies that are no longer service providers. They are actually financial investors. Like, for instance, in the last study that we made, the time is over. Okay, we can discuss this in the Q&A.